Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias, and welcome to the Inter-American Dialogue. And thank you for braving the cold and the snow this morning. You're all real troopers. And also, thank you for your patience. Things are a little bit delayed, and we're sorry about that. But we have a great program this morning and a special event on situation in Puerto Rico, what lies ahead. It's important to keep a sharp focus, I think, in our discussion this morning about looking forward. There's a lot of background, there's a lot of history that's certainly very relevant and very important. But we're in a situation where I think it's urgent to talk about measures that are being taken currently and those that need to be pursued by relevant players and relevant actors to address the major challenges in Puerto Rico, above all the fiscal problem, and trying to get Puerto Rico's economy on track. The discussion changes on Puerto Rico. A few years ago, we talked a lot about political status, Puerto Rico, but I think that's still extremely important. But I think today we want to focus on the economic and fiscal issues. The island has been in recession for about a dozen years, and also there continues to be high levels of out-migration, of emigration, Puerto Rico. The island faces the formidable tasks and complex tasks of reconstruction, especially in the aftermath of the devastating Hurricane Maria in September of 2017. So this morning, we're going to talk about the progress that's been made, what else needs to happen, what is the role of the local government, what's the role of the federal government, private sector, working together to try to make progress. We're extremely honored and fortunate this morning to have with us Puerto Rico's Secretary of State, Luis Rivera-Marín, position that he's held for just over 2 years. He's the island's 35th Secretary of State, appointed by the governor and confirmed by Puerto Rico's legislator. You have his bio. I won't go into it because we don't have a lot of time, and it's very extensive, very impressive, and he's had a very distinguished career, a lawyer with a degree from the University of Puerto Rico. The idea is that the Secretary will make some initial remarks, and then we'll have a brief conversation, have time for a question or two before we move to a panel of experts who will be joining us later to elaborate on some of the points that the Secretary has made. Before I give the Secretary the floor, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank the hard work of my colleague, Ricardo Barrios, who's a program associate here for the Asia and Latin America program, but he really is the person who's been responsible for coordinating this event, shaping the agenda, and reaching out to our wonderful speakers. The dialogue has focused some attention on Puerto Rico in events and publications, but certainly not enough. So I want to thank Ricardo for pushing and prodding us to do this event. With that, I am honored and pleased to welcome the Secretary. You're very gracious to be with us this morning. We're honored to have you, and we're sorry we couldn't treat you better with the weather, but this is the best we can do. So, Mr. Secretary, please come on.
Good morning to you all, and thank you, Michael and Ricardo and all the staff at the Dialogue to allow us to have this conversation this morning, and to all of us joining us through the media and here in Washington, D.C. I think this is a great preview for Super Bowl weekend, and weather brings me here, and in terms of it's precisely what the events that Puerto Rico faced a couple of years ago, back in September 2017, whereby we were struck by a great storm. But as you very well described, there's been a financial storm in Puerto Rico since 2006, since We've seen a continuous deceleration of our economy. And I'm not going to go into my bio, but what it's pertinent at this moment is back in the administration of Governor Fortunio. I was in charge of commerce and energy as a regulator, and thereafter tourism. Certainly, major areas require to be properly aligned in this global world if we're going to have any economic development, sustained economic development in the island. And when we started the administration with Governor Ricardo Rosselló back in January, we had started an administration with close to $2 billion structural deficit in the government's budget. We were recently downgraded to non-investment grade by major bond credit rating agencies. So it was a very challenging time. We started with a transformation whereby there were major transformation in the permitting process in the island to ease the way of doing business in Puerto Rico, major um, transformations in labor law. We worked with transformations in other areas like health. And we were on the right track, working very hard in our government program. Then nature came and struck us first with Irma. When, uh, when Irma struck us, we were lucky enough to just have minor damages. That is what usually happens in Puerto Rico. Either the eastern, the southern, the western part struck, but this time we were able to get back on our feet, get our grid back online in a couple of days. And we were helping U.S. citizens that were stranded in the island's leeward, and we pursued the largest repatriation effort in the U.S. history, bringing thousands of U.S. citizens back to Puerto Rico for dialysis, for health treatment, and getting them back home. But then in September, we were visited by this monster, and it changed Puerto Rico, changed our reality. Desolation, major destruction, and you all saw that. You all saw that. And the inequalities of Puerto Rico were shown very clearly. You could see them around the world in pictures because these are the homes that whereby our families has live. You know, dignified housing. It required major rebuilding. We were not going to build in flood-prone zones, so we started reconstruction, helping those families. The one with the yellow shirt, that's me. And 2 hours later, that house what came down the cliff. Uh, the destruction was recently detailed in a document that we filed with the with Congress. It's a major document that details what needs to be done, bring Puerto Rico back better. It's an economic and disaster plan that we are pursuing, and it's under the consideration. We're working together with you as part of a conversation, and the federal government and federal agencies and Congress. Puerto Rico, as people, we are resilient, but we need help. We need resources. And we thank all of you. We thank organizations like the Dialogue that give us an opportunity to make sure that when we do it right, we do it better, and we do it more resiliently. We're getting our power grid back, but we have been transforming our structure. We have a PREPA, which is a state-owned monopoly utility company. It's a lazy monopoly. So when the storm hit us, it was fragile. So what we were able to work out with FEMA through an amendment to the Stafford Act, which is Section 428, to allow, instead of building like the day before, which is not the right way to spend taxpayers' funds. We are working on rebuilding a new grid, and we're working with the Department of Energy, and we are working with stakeholders that are here with us that has helped us with the design and reconstruction of a better grid. In order to fix what has been the operation of PREPA that rely almost in three quarters of the produced energy on fossil fuels, specifically bunker oil, that brings, we pay the highest kilowatt hour in probably the hemisphere. We are transforming PREPA, and we have awarded a RFP to an enterprise that will be bringing natural gas, and we're going to be transforming our power plant in San Juan, where most of the power is consumed, and that way we can allow to reach our objective of cleaner, more reliable, and more efficient energy that shall not only provide for a more resilient system, because we were producing in the south, transmitting to the north, and if one single line, major transmission line broke, then that was major repair around the mountains, and our topography is accidental. So that's what we're working now with the federal government and making sure those funds are deployed. We've been victims also of the shutdown. We have two major sources of income, or not income, of federal funds, which are CDBG-DR through HUD, and then we have FEMA as sources of funds, together with private insurance companies, together with state funds that need to be matched. In terms of CDBG-DR, just a year after Hurricane Maria hit us, we had the visit of Secretary Carson, and we were able to sign a grant agreement for the first $1.5 billion that were basically targeted for unmet needs. Right now, we are working with $18.5 billion that have been assigned to gap low-income housing needs in Puerto Rico, relocation of thousands of families that are currently living in not dignified housing, in flood-prone zones. So that requires titling, require major housing development initiatives that we are working close with the municipalities. We have 78 municipalities in the island, and all those projects that have been identified by local leaders have been made part of an action plan that is before HUD, and this action plan was due by a statutory period that lapsed. Because of the shutdown, they require an additional term, and we're working very closely with the federal agencies to make sure that funds start going to the island, and so we can initiate these major projects. Certainly with FEMA, we were probably the first jurisdiction to take advantage of Section 428. The disbursement of funds, it's divided between emergency works and permanent works, and in terms of public assistance, we are asking a match of 100% of those emergency works, and we have not been successful through the executive branch. So now we're working, and I thank Senator Rick Scott, which recently pursues an amendment whereby the federal government may allow us to that the 100% of those funds are covered. Certainly, Puerto Rico is not in the same financial conditions as a state like Texas or California, which is facing similar emergencies. So we truly are seeking sensibility in this sense. Just recently, I think yesterday, FEMA announced the disbursement of $28.8 million for what its emergency works. But what we're really working is that the funds for the permanent works, they call C2G, those that are needed to rebuild, start moving. Puerto Rico is being treated as a high-risk jurisdiction, nevertheless has not been determined or ruled as a high-risk jurisdiction by FEMA. That requires a bureaucratic process, which is Form 270 for every work. It's what they call a PW, a project worksheet. We haven't got one, The disbursement rate has been very slow. We are working together with FEMA to make sure that we find ways to make it that process more agile. You know, we've been victims. The same. I've been before Congress with Brock Long, and he has recognized that the rules, the procedures are bureaucratic, but that what at the end, what signifies is and relates is to continue the suffering of the people. You fly over the island and you still see blue tarps. We need to act fast. We need to act on a timely manner, and ask to the federal agency is to find ways where we can somehow make this process more agile, more less bureaucratic, and which allow us. In terms of the administration of Ricardo Rosselló, we've been responsible in capacity building, in making sure that the funds are properly invested. At the end, they are taxpayers' funds, and we've structured what we call Core 3, which is a whole structure to make sure there's transparency and compliance in the deployment of funds. So we feel comfortable. We've done it with a great support from consultants that have done it very successfully in other states. So we're working very close to make sure that action plan in HUD is properly approved within the next few days, and that we can start working in building a better Puerto Rico. The transformation and innovation in the wake of devastation, as I told you, we're talking about, and we work together with the federal agencies. It's 139 billion. I just want you to relate to the magnitude of this disaster that we faced. It was a complete disruption, but like I say, Puerto Rico was carrying and was lagging in economic development. I think this is an opportunity. Many say that in a crisis, there's opportunity, as that's the way we see that. With that investment, but we can create is opportunities for the Puerto Rican families, for our students. We have made major transformation in the educational system, whereby we believe that through innovation, through our workforce development, at the end, Puerto Rico is a major biopharma hub in the world. We are big in medical devices. We got great engineer schools. So our greatest asset is our people. So we want to make sure that those students that graduate from our university, those doctors, those physicians, those engineers, have an opportunity in the island, so we can promote through these investments that we're making in the island, target them in a way that will provide for sustainable economic development, and we can pivot. The signals are there. We recently, like I said, put an RFQ for the transformation of our energy grid, whereby we'll be concessioning through a public-private partnership the transmission and distribution of power in the island. And if you're talking about signals and how the market feels, we had more than 6 companies submit their qualifications. So there's great interest in investing in Puerto Rico and making this a more robust and harder system. We're starting working already with major transformation, and what we need now is to build back better. And recently, we're facing the new tax reform, the federal tax reform, and we're working now in ways where, together with the rebuilding that we're making and the possibility of opportunity zones, we can restore growth and prosperity to the island. I think forums like this, whereby we can have an open conversation, where you can advocate for Puerto Rico's treatment, would allow to bring justice to Puerto Rico. The inequalities that we face, because we lack representation in the Senate, because we lack representation in Congress, certainly reflects many times in the treatment that we get. And this relates not only to disaster recovery, this relates also even to health. These are numbers that I know we're short on time, but this is where Puerto Ricans stand, like in Medicaid spending. We are poor. We are poorer than, we get less than half the household income that Mississippi gets. But see what we get. So this is what per capita is capped, and what we need. Then the state government needs to fill that gap with the limitations that we have. With the highest enrollment and minuscule compared federal per capita spending. And then we have, because of our island condition, because of different market conditions, that's our cost of living. So the equation, it's against us. When you look at inequities and how it reflects in healthcare, which is, government is for security, education, and health. That should be your core, right? This is where Puerto Rico stands. These are actual data. And we're getting worse. This is 2011, 2019. The gap is increased. These are the Puerto Rican counties, what they get and benchmarking in terms of the federal funds we get for Medicare Advantage. And we pay the same Medicare taxes that every U.S. county pays. And that's an inequity that shall stop. And this is the call we make for you as advocates and whereby you discuss in your different forums. So these inequities relate to our condition, and that's probably why many on the underlying factors at the end are these inequalities. So when you look at recent statement from the budget office, it's a statement of administration policy. And that statement says that in the Supplemental Appropriation Act of 2019, Puerto Rico shall not receive 600 million that were earmarked for NAP funds because they are unnecessary and excessive funding Puerto Rico. Our duty is to illustrate the OMB and let them know that Puerto Rico has, like in health, a cap fund for NAP, and that we receive, compared to Alaska, non-contiguous state, and Hawaii, they receive 150% more than us in terms of food for our people. So we're moving in the right direction with your support. We are all ready to work, and as we got up from nature's monster that struck us, we are ready to make our economy better and bring opportunities so Puerto Ricans don't have to relocate in the States, and they can find opportunities for good education and for good health for the children in the island. And we can make Puerto Rico a better place. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Secretary, for your remarks. I think both very realistic and also hopeful. And you're right, the Puerto Ricans are very resilient. I think I would like to do is, we just have a few minutes, but perhaps I can ask a question and then maybe we can get one question from the audience and then turn it back to you if that's okay. My question has to do with the role of the Puerto Ricans in the mainland. And what role have they played? Are you satisfied? Did you expect more? What else can be done? I mean, seems to be a significant source potentially of enormous support. And if you could just say a few words about that. And why don't we get one other? Is there anybody who would like to pose a question to the secretary? Okay, let's have one question there, and then we'll go back to.
Right.
Yes, sir. Please, we get a microphone to.
Hi, Colin Grabo with the Cato Institute. My question for you is with regard to the revamp of Puerto Rico's energy sector. You mentioned the desire to replace bunker fuel with LNG. Of course, that's going to be difficult to take full advantage of natural gas as long as the Jones Act remains in place, which cuts off Puerto Rico from natural gas from the United States mainland. There's not a single LNG Jones Act carrier. Of course, Puerto Rico has applied for a waiver. I'm wondering if you could speak to prospects for the waiver, any conversations that you've had with the Trump administration regarding how receptive they are to that, and just more generally, the impact of the Jones Act and what your administration is looking to do to highlight the cost of the Jones Act to Puerto Rico.
Certainly. Because of our island condition, we certainly rely in air and sea trade in order to bring in sources of energy. We recently filed with DHS a waiver, as you well said, regarding an exemption to the Jones Act. And for those not familiar, it's basically because we are a territory of the United States, any transportation, air or sea, from any state, interstate commerce, and the island requires that it should be done in a U.S. ship flag vessel with with Americans, U.S. citizens as crewmen. When we look at American energy policy, we talk about energy independence and how plentiful God has blessed us with energy sources, especially in LNG, at a cost that could greatly improve our possibilities to regain and get traction in terms of economic development. If we rely on tourism, those hotels need an efficient and reliable energy source. And we see as a natural that align with US national energy policy regarding American energy independence. Why? Because of Jones Act, we need to source LNG from Trinidad or from Russia. So we recently filed that petition, and it's very well documented. There's an exemption to ships built before 1996, and through the proper channels and Marat, we certify there's no chip available. So we have conditioned the approval as soon as there's a chip and the chip builders find there's a market, then we'll use the US chip. But it is to the best interest of Puerto Rico, U.S. citizens living in Puerto Rico. It is in the best interest. The policy of the administration is to allow Puerto Rico to regain economic development. Energy is that ingredient and that source of input for every industry. It's well documented the impact in cost in terms of when you compare it to sourcing from other maybe unreliable sources. So we're very hopeful. And it's currently under review and comments by the Department of Energy, and we have met with White House officials. I've met personally with U.S. Department of Energy officials to make them aware of how just, proper, and necessary is that we can have access to LNG sources in the Gulf Coast.
Address the other question about.
Yeah, certainly Puerto Rico. When we talk about the prospects, you were asking me regarding
Puerto Ricans here.
the way the diaspora, our friends that live around the island, and I think I'm here as a storyteller. You know, when I talk to Kate about the necessity, we need to tell a story, and I don't see a better storyteller than Lin-Manuel Miranda and how he through his play has tell the story about the founding fathers and what made this great nation great and the principles of equality and how that translates into Puerto Rico. But just recently he brought his play down and you could see major leaders from Sonia Sotomayor to Lin-Manuel to many others that came to the island to keep the spotlight. Because disasters like this may make the news, the world news for a few weeks, but then they might forget us. And we need the support from Puerto Rico continuously. And if there's been a voice that has been heard, and this goes across party politics, this is one of those issues that everybody's together, and you can tell the story differently, but at the end, it's about bringing justice to Puerto Rico, allowing us to have opportunities. And many of the inequalities that I was able to portray to you, it's been part of our conversation for decades, looking for ways that we can get a treatment or our aspirations so we can provide our children. At the end, many of those that live here, they moved because, Puerto Rico, you relocate by purchasing a plane ticket. You don't, it's as easy as that. Many of them still have their families back in the island and want the best for them, and in return, and that's what we're working for. So those that are around right now, raising their voices around the nation for the better of their people, which they love, can see an opportunity in the island. So what we need from is first gratefulness for all the support we're getting from everyone, because I say I everyone felt the support that we had from the federal government, from the NGOs, from Puerto Ricans that make their home now in the mainland. So what we need is that to be continued until we truly find that as our aspirations as people that want opportunities, good health and good education and good job opportunities for our children is attained.
Terrific. Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, you've done exactly what we'd hoped you'd do. You set out the issues and challenges, and we really appreciate you joining us this morning and sharing your insights. Been very informative, very interesting. We're now that you've set all the issues, we're now going to turn to a panel of three experts who have been following this, and we'll explore even further these questions. But really appreciate you joining us, and please thank please thank the Secretary for joining us this morning.
Thank you. I look forward for the discussion. Thank you.
We're going to move right now to the session, so if the speakers could please come to the platform. Yeah. Well, the Secretary has really, I think, laid out in his remarks some of the key questions that we want to pursue now in our discussion, and what needs to happen next in Puerto Rico, and how all of us could be helpful. We're really very fortunate to have with us three superb speakers, outstanding experts on Puerto Rico, who have agreed to come and share their thoughts with us this morning. Brad Setzer is from the Council on Foreign Relations. Rossana Torres is from the Center for the New Economy. And Richard Campbell works at the Congressional Research Service. And they all bring a lot of expertise and interesting ideas about this complex challenge. I'd like to start with Brad, if I could. And if you could just tell us, you've said that basically if Puerto Rico doesn't experience strong growth in fiscal 2019, it never will. Can you tell us why you think this year, 2019, is so important, and realistically, what do you see as the outlook?
Starting roughly in 2006, Puerto Rico entered into a very sustained long-term economic slump. So ballpark GDP fell over that period of time by about 15%. And if you get any kind of reasonable estimate of the trend rate of growth, there wasn't a trend rate of growth. There was a trend rate of decline. Modest, but Puerto Rico's economy had basically been steadily shrinking. That was the situation going into the devastation of Hurricane Maria. Obviously, a hurricane in the short run is a devastating negative shock to output. No power, no production, no ability to conduct. To be honest, can I do it without a mic? No. This feels incredibly awkward. The commerce for about a quarter, more or less, came to a halt. But after a hurricane, there's a natural process of recovery. And Puerto Rico received maybe not enough, but a quite substantial amount of federal disaster aid. And that federal disaster aid when you kind of do the economic analysis of what, let's say, an average influx of federal money, it's close to $10 billion a year for the next several years, should mean for an economy of the size of Puerto Rico, you come up with a substantial sum. Puerto Rico's economy is about $70 billion. 10 is large relative to 70. And while not all of the 10 billion will be spent in Puerto Rico, a substantial amount will. The board has estimated maybe 20%, and that money is basically manna from heaven. It's a grant. And so you work that out, and Puerto Rico is now receiving, should be receiving, a fiscal stimulus of several percentage points of GDP. You see that in a host of economic indicators. You see that in the increase in tax revenue. And hence, this is about, unfortunately, in economic terms, as good as you're going to get when it comes to the year-over-year change. I think the risk is that this boost is temporary. It's not 1 year, it's 5 years or 6 years. You know, the estimates change, but at some point the federal disaster relief money runs out, and unfortunately then there's a almost equal negative shock.
So this is the critical year.
I think it's a critical year. Well, first of all, it should be a year of recovery. If you don't have a year of recovery when you should have a year of recovery, that's a problem. But it's also a critical year because the debt restructuring, in some sense, is coming to a head. And one of the core variables in the debt restructuring is an assessment of Puerto Rico's capacity to pay. And so understanding whether this temporary, whether the federal boost is temporary or permanent is quite central to understanding what Puerto Rico can reasonably be expected to pay on its debts going forward.
Great. Thank you very much. Rossana, the center where you work has come up with a report, strategy that seeks to achieve short-term growth and long-term development in Puerto Rico. If you could just share with us sort of the main points of your report, I think that would be interesting. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me. I do love the title of this conversation because I think we have to start looking past the response and recovery efforts immediately after the hurricane and all of the baggage that brings, and look forward to what 2019 can bring and the future for Puerto Rico. As you very well stated, the Center for a New Economy has been looking at issues in Puerto Rico as the only think tank in Puerto Rico for the past 20 years. And we've recently established a footprint here in DC. So we're hoping to serve as a resource to a lot of the federal agencies working on issues related to Puerto Rico, and also congressional staff and members. So I think in terms of where we are and where we're headed, according to the latest local government economic activity index, economic activity has declined consecutively for the past 3 months. And that's important because, as Brad was stating earlier, there has been an economic stimulus that has been claimed not only by the local government, but also it's included in the fiscal plan. And again, as Brad was mentioning, this stimulus is temporary, and as long as that sugar high, when that sugar high ends, and we've seen it in these past 3 months that it is already ending, what is the plan? And, what we can see is that unless Puerto Rico symptomatically addresses the core issues, there really isn't a path forward for Puerto Rico. And I remember very well when Promesa was being drafted, many stakeholders, including the Center for a New Economy, argued that a piecemeal approach wouldn't work. At that moment, the legislative strategy was calling for a comprehensive debt restructuring tool, a strong oversight of a fiscal board. Then there was also 2 components which Congress did not address at the time, and there was a fix to Medicaid, which is a substantial amount of the government expenditures, as well as economic development tools. The one that was most acclaimed was the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. Now, unless Puerto Rico gets these tools, Puerto Rico will not necessarily get out of its stump. Despite the name of economic stability that Promesa alludes to, the only wasn't really a tool, but the only economic portion that was addressed in the legislation was to create a congressional task force report that would look at all of the core federal policy issues that could be undertaken. Now, there has been very limited amount of progress on the recommendations that were included in that task force report. And what the center is looking at now is what can we do to rehash that work and really look at what can be done in the future. Of course, the usual suspects of Medicaid and EITC are in there, but we should also look at the incorporation of a lot of the statistical programs that federal agencies provide to other states that are not included for Puerto Rico.
Great, thank you very, very much, Sana. Richard, you follow more closely than anybody the question of energy infrastructure in Puerto Rico. You've done a lot of reports and a lot of speaking about this. If you could just give us your sense of how you think that Puerto Rico could most effectively upgrade its energy infrastructure today, and what are the challenges and what progress, if any, has been made?
Well, I did have some remarks prepared, but I'll focus on your question. Puerto Rico, over the last couple of months, has made a number of attempts in legislation to look at how they can rebuild the system. They're looking at incorporating renewables, they're looking at incorporating distributed generation, they're looking at opening up the system so that co-ops can exist. They're taking away the monopoly that PREPA had over electric power generation and distribution, and they are attempting to open up the system. Senate Bill 1121, which had many of those proposals, I think was an admirable first step. They're looking at rebuilding the system because, again, the system was in poor condition when it was originally, and rebuilding the system after the hurricanes has been more of a patchwork attempt, and it will take years to really get the system up to where it could be considered on a par with utilities on the mainland. They are also looking at putting in needed reforms as far as standards and codes, which were not really followed and really led to the downgrade of the system in Puerto Rico. If those standards are put in place and followed and maintenance is followed, then you will see a system that can rebound in a few years. Again, what will happen with generation, that's a big question. Puerto Rico, at least the government, envisions privatizing generation. They're looking at getting bidders to come in and look at buying up the generation and modernizing it. But when you look at, for example, Palo Seco and San Juan, those units are about 40 years old. It's not really something that anybody would want to come in and buy. It's not something that anybody could really make money off of. Anybody coming into Puerto Rico is, I think, going to be looking at making a profit off the system. And if they are not able to recover their costs, then it will be an extremely difficult preposition for those people to justify, especially utilities, investor-owned utilities, how they can come into Puerto Rico, invest, and make a profit off of that investment. So again, while the government is looking at how they can open up the system, they're looking at Duke and Exelon, PSEG, and the Quanta Consortium, for example, as potential bidders for running the transmission distribution system, how the mechanics of that system will work, how the oversight of that system will work, how incentives will be provided to folks coming into Puerto Rico to be able to make that profit, to justify their investment and make further investments over time, still have to be worked out. Again, Senate Bill 1121, to my understanding, died out of procedural matters, and then disagreements. I think one key disagreement was an amendment from the House that looked at limiting the price of electricity in Puerto Rico at 20 cents per kilowatt hour, and that level was considered not enough for folks to consider investing in Puerto Rico. So the first steps are being made. the investment that's been authorized by the federal government through HUD funds, that's only about $2 billion. And if you're looking at the needs that I think have been forecast for rebuilding the system in Puerto Rico, especially over the 5 years, considerably above that. So whoever comes in will have to look at making their own investment and then looking at, again, how does that investment result in a return?
Perfect. Thank you very much. We have about a half hour, a little over a half hour, and my sense is that this time could be most productively used by engaging all of you. I see a lot of people around here with a lot of background and expertise and interest, and to take advantage of our three excellent speakers. So I want to open it up, and I only ask that that you please identify yourselves and try to keep your question brief. You don't have to disguise your comment as a question. You're free to make a comment and just react to what you've heard and also share your own thoughts. So why don't we try to take a couple of rounds, and you can address it to a specific speaker or just make a general comment or point. So who would like to start up? I know there are a lot of people here who follow this very closely. I know who you are. Nobody? Yes, sir. Please. Start there, and then we'll go over here.
Hi, Michael Whalen, Berkeley Research Group. Question for Brad. What do you see as the end game on the debt restructuring negotiations, particularly with the influx of federal funding through FEMA and otherwise? Obviously, there are a lot of investors in Puerto Rican paper who perhaps are a little bit more optimistic than they were at the time that the Oversight Board was put into place. And as an adjunct to that question, is it your expectation that there will be an effort to repudiate portions of that debt under an argument that it was not properly constituted as being an obligation of Puerto Rico when issued?
Thank you very much. We can take another one. Yes, over here, please.
Hi, thank you. Marilyn Shapley with Mercy Corps, and we're proud to partner with several private sector companies to help get out the message that Puerto Rico is open for business, particularly around tourism right now. So I was wondering to hear a little bit more about how the tourism sector has been recovering post-Maria. What are the opportunities looking forward, and are there challenges that need additional attention? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Is there another comment or question? If not, why don't we, you could think about it for the next round. Why don't we turn to Brad, and then anybody wants to take the tourism question. Brad?
So I think it's clear that the Oversight Board is challenging some portion of the Constitution on the grounds that it was issued improperly. I have no idea how that particular challenge will ultimately be resolved. There are going to be, I think, ongoing litigation. There will be ongoing litigation also around some of the smaller categories of claims. And I'm going to sort of set that aside. The core of Puerto Rico's debt restructuring has all, for the Commonwealth, for the government, set aside PREPA, set aside PRASA, important, but they have their own process. The core of the debt restructuring hinges on settlement with the two central categories of debt, the sales tax-backed bonds, COFINA, and the general obligation or constitutional bonds. A deal, more or less, has been finalized with the sales tax-backed bonds. The sales tax-backed bonds had what I've called a nuclear structure in the following sense. The bulk of the COFINA debt took the form of something called a capital appreciation bond, which doesn't pay out today, but pays out over time. The headline value of the capital appreciation bonds that COFINA issued before the debt restructuring was about $5 billion. The ultimate payment on that set of debt was $25 billion. The current interest bonds, there were about 12 billion of them before the restructuring, and that was all that was paying interest right now. So if you looked at what COFINA structurally promised investors, it had promised payments that went from 0.7 billion today to like 1.8 billion in the future. So a steep upward increase in future payments, which was incompatible with an economy in decline. The restructuring of that subset of debt reduced the payments. So structurally, Puerto Rico is going to pay about $500 million now, and it goes up over time to $1 billion. The basic problem with that is that you still have the escalating structure of payments. Over time, Puerto Rico has to pay more on the COFINA bonds, and 20 years from now, Puerto Rico will be paying $1 billion on a set of debt that is now paying $700 million on. So that's kind of the baseline we have, assuming that all the I's get crossed, for Puerto Rico's future debt payments. I think that's all more or less settled. So what does a future commitment of $1 billion mean for an economy like Puerto Rico? I got a strong view on how you need to look at Puerto Rico's debt sustainability. You need to look at Puerto Rico's debt service commitments relative to Puerto Rico's own revenues. Throw out federal aid. Don't count it. Look at it like a municipality, and look at the benchmarks for municipal debt service. The average is about 5% of your own revenue, and for highly indebted states, the average, and I know Puerto Rico is not a state, but it's kind of the best analogy, is 9. If you look at estimates of Puerto Rico's forward revenues, they center at a little over $15 billion a year, which implies a future debt service envelope of between, let's say, $750 million and a little under $1.5 billion. Of that, $1 billion has, in my view, already been pledged to the COFINA structure, and the remaining restructuring has to fit within that envelope. It creates a strange restructuring from a technical point of view because Puerto Rico's near-term capacity to pay is actually bigger than its long-run capacity to pay, partially because the COFINA structure escalates in this very unfavorable way, and the restructuring didn't change that, and partially because the federal aid goes away. So right now, benefiting from persist forever until Congress changes the law. And indirectly, the influx of federal aid has raised the tax base. So right now, Puerto Rico actually has more money than it likely will have in 10 years' time. That makes for a complicated debt restructuring, a difficult technical negotiation, and one where, at least in my view, I'm going to be controversial. Some of you guys have detailed knowledge of Puerto Rico's debt structure. I don't think anything close to the COFINA deal can be replicated for the GOs. I think that is now somewhat priced in, so it is still possible to do a deal. But I think we need to have a clear understanding of what the COFINA deal means for Puerto Rico's capacity to service other sets of claims.
Thank you. Rossana, do you want to, that was very helpful. Rossana, do you want to take the question of the
Sure. Tourism.
Tourism.
So I think I'll just stay to the facts here on tourism. Despite what many people would like to see Puerto Rico become, this premier spot of a tourism destination, the percentage that it contributes to the economy usually fluctuates between 6 to 8%. So it's a very, I wouldn't say insignificant, but it's a very small amount of what it contributes to the economy. And a lot of it has to do with our unique political relationship with the United States. Puerto Rico can't compete with the prices that are offered by other Caribbean islands because of the minimum wage provisions that Puerto Rico has to abide by. So in that sense, I don't foresee the tourism sector to grow past what it has already been fluctuating under those numbers. But in that sense, that's kind of why I've been saying from the very beginning that we have to comprehensively get to the root of the issues, and that requires congressional action. We can't change the current structural issues and what Puerto Rico is going through unless there is real economic development tools provided to Puerto Rico. And listen, it's been done in the past. I mean, there is federal precedent for this. When DC got their control board in '95, that did not come with any economic stimulus. And lawmakers and policymakers were confronted with that reality 2 years later when in oversight hearings, DC, their oversight board indicated unless we get any economic development tools, we're not going to get out of this rut. And Puerto Rico has, just recently hit that 2-year mark. We are at this point where we do need additional economic development tools to really get moving forward.
Thank you. Richard, you want to add anything to the debt restructuring or the tourism? Or no?
On the tourism question, I'll say Puerto Rico is a beautiful country and it's a nice place to go and visit, so I'd encourage you all to do that. On the debt
I'm glad we have one point of consensus here. Good.
As regards the debt restructuring, I mean, PREPA's debt of $9 billion is a major. Is considering just wiping out that debt. To me, that would be the ultimate solution. But again, dealing with that debt and dealing with modernization and eventually hardening the infrastructure in Puerto Rico is going to be a big issue.
Great, thank you. Let's do another round. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. Let's do another round. We'll start with Peter Hakem, who's over there. Peter, please wait for the microphone. Peter is the former president of the Inter-American Dialogue and now a senior fellow here.
I don't know if this question is appropriate, but the panel is focused almost exclusively on economic issues. And we've seen Puerto Rico go through 2 recent crises that are very, and I follow the argument that it may be facing another economic crisis in the not too distant future. What does this do to the politics of Puerto Rico? Does it change it in any way, or are we just going to continue seeing the 2 parties sort of battling over the issue of status with regard to the U.S.? Or, in other words, is there a sort of a political basis for what's going to happen next with regard to Puerto Rico and with regard to its relation with the U.S.?
Thank you. Yes, question over here, please.
Hello. Buenos dias. I'm Daniela. I'm the president of the Puerto Rican Student Organization at American University. I just had a question since we're talking about what lies ahead. I think one of the things we need to address is education because the youth right now, they're the future leaders of Puerto Rico. So for the panel in general, could you elaborate on the current prospect and the future of the University of Puerto Rico, given the unfortunate budget cuts implemented by La Junta, the Federal Fiscal Control Board, as well as the university's current risk of losing its middle states accreditation and what that means for the future of Puerto Rico and its students, especially its low-income students? Thank you.
Thank you. Another question, or okay, why don't we go back to Brad? You want to take the first one on the politics, or you don't want to touch the politics?
I
don't want to go
have
there.
no natural affinity for Puerto Rico in the sense that I'm from the Midwest, rather obviously. And so I think it's
like summer.
Yeah, correct. I thought it was balmy this morning. So I will leave the status debate to Rosanna. But I do want to say something on that. My personal view is that independent of how the statehood versus commonwealth debate is settled, the existing fiscal bargain with the United States is untenable and needs to be renegotiated. That is what lies behind the absence of comparable Medicaid funding. Puerto Rico as a territory doesn't pay federal income tax. Medicaid historically has been funded out of federal income tax. So therefore, the logic was Puerto Rico shouldn't receive the same amount of Medicaid funding. As Puerto Rico ages, and Puerto Rico's demographics are very striking, it will soon be one of the oldest parts of the United States. It is impossible, in my view, for Puerto Rico not to receive comparable Medicaid funding. Simply impossible. That has been papered over for the past 10 years with temporary appropriations. but it structurally needs to be fixed. Rosanna alluded to the earned income tax credit. One of the striking things about the US tax code is that most people earning what the median income in Puerto Rico is, $20,000, get money back through the federal income tax system. They don't pay into it. So because Puerto Rico is not part of the federal income tax system, Puerto Ricans who earn below, let's say, $35,000 are actually getting a raw deal. They would typically, if you have children, so forth and so on, be receiving a check back from the federal government through the earned income tax credit. And that can be quite substantial if you have several children, several $1,000s. I think that is ultimately untenable because you can, as a Puerto Rican, as an American citizen, move to Florida and receive the earned income tax credit. You can go through that host of issues, and I don't think in the long run the current bargain works. Conversely, to be controversial, I don't think the US can, on a long-term basis, allow Puerto Rico to engage in tax competition, corporate tax competition, with the US federal treasury. So things like Act 154, which provide close to 20%, like 15% of the overall revenue, 20% of the more narrow budget, are ultimately, in my view, untenable. And we have to think about replacing the support that is provided through the back door, largely to corporations, with a more viable, in the long run, system of support for Puerto Rico.
Thank you. Rosanna, you want to touch the politics and education, or?
Sure. So I think on the political debate, this is not the first time that status comes up. It probably will not be the last time that it comes up. That's because unless there is congressional appetite, political will to address that issue, it simply will become, part of the conversation, but never really resolved. I think that's why it's so important to, maybe invest in education and look at other social issues before addressing the status. There's no debate that is the core of all of the issues. That is the reason why Puerto Rico does not participate in all the federal programs and why there's discrepancy in every federal program. But from our perspective, what we can tell is that the most unfortunate bystander of that political debate and on status is that the institutions have suffered for many years. What we have in the U.S. in terms of the Office of Management and Budget, the Treasury Department, these institutions, the Department of Justice, in Puerto Rico, most of the time, and I don't want to categorize, they change every 4 years, from everywhere from the janitor to the secretary, and that is at the core of all the problems, that you don't have that institutional capacity to see what has worked, what has not worked, to keep certain policies dictated by previous administrations that have worked, to keep them functioning. And on the education question, I think, yes, it is very unfortunate that at this point, the Oversight Board and this fiscal plan has been using the argument of this fiscal stimulus to implement austerity measures, to make cuts on the Department of Education, on the University of Puerto Rico, which I am a proud alum of. And yes, we do have to address what that means for Puerto Rico. I think in terms, I guess, yes, in the government side of things, it is a very unfortunate decision that has been made on education. But in that sense, I think it's also up to the students to start investing once again in their schools.
Richard, if you wanted to comment on any of that, but I also wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about the privatization of PREPA and how you see that going. Is it the right thing to do? Are there pitfalls and concerns, or if you can elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, first, I'll make a comment on the education situation. Puerto Rico has been losing population for a while, and I think one of the ways to encourage the population to stay is to have reforms in the education system so that the students do have reasons to stay, build businesses in Puerto Rico, or otherwise become involved in the institutions. As regards the privatization of PREPA, you know, it's not a large island. And when I wrote my first report on Puerto Rico, I think one of the options that was suggested for Congress to consider was to look at some type of power marketing agency, that basically a federal power marketing agency, so that you would have some type of federally responsible entity running the power generation, transmission, distribution system. Again, having a private entity or having private entities in charge of generation, the question again for them is, how do they make money off of a situation where they're going to have to come in, make an investment? Not, you know, the fuel situation is unsure with the Jones Act. Having LNG come in seems to be an option that sort of makes sense. I mean, there's other options for power generation that aren't being considered, such as small modular nuclear reactors, which could provide fuel certainty. But again, for power generation to be privatized, these entities are going to look at the debt, and they are going to look at the infrastructure. And again, it's a very difficult situation to address in terms of keeping rates low. I could see rates increasing. They need to have some type of perhaps federal policy that can help, or subsidy that can keep rates low in order for that option to work.
Thank you. Any final questions or comments for our terrific panel? Ricardo, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This one also goes out to Mr. Campbell. There's a lot of talk about the energy sector on the island, part of it about just building it up, and part of it about actually switching to renewables. So I wanted to ask, in the I don't know, next 10 years, is it really feasible to prioritize renewable energy, or is it even the logical choice? I want to see your insight, as well as any other panelists, regarding, is it a choice, or is it, what is it?
I think it's most definitely a choice. I mean, Puerto Rico has great resources of solar, wind, and ocean resources. The only question is, how do you build those resources in a way that makes them resilient and reliable? Folks have been talking about energy storage as being an option. Yes, it's an option, but it's also expensive. You also have to build up the grid to make energy storage work. So I think that it's definitely an option over the short term to increase the amount of renewable energy that's there in Puerto Rico. But again, if you're looking at what can be done in the next 10 years, I think you're looking at about less than 5% renewables now. The grid has to be upgraded in order to allow for the two-way flows of electricity, where renewables could make a real impact. And I can't see renewables making a real impact in Puerto Rico over the next 10 years of more than 10% at most. But that all depends on the investment that's available.
Thank you. Anybody want to add to that or no? Okay, well, if there are no other questions or comments, I would just want to thank everybody for joining us, especially given the weather conditions. I think this has been a terrific session. I want to thank Secretary Marín, and I want to thank Brad and Rosanna and Richard for sharing their expertise and insights with us this morning. We're going to continue to be doing events on Puerto Rico because this is going to be a crucial issue, and there are a lot of questions I think have been raised that we want to follow and discuss closely. And finally, another thanks to Ricardo Barrios for his great work on this, and hopefully we'll keep this up, and we appreciate your contribution, Ricardo. And so thank you all very, very much for coming, and try to stay warm and have a good weekend. Thank you.